Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to ITAC at a very important and exciting program we're going to have today. I'm Ann Wallace, and I'm president of ITAC, the Identity Theft Assistance Center. And let me give you a little background before we launch into this very important topic. As some of you, many of you know, ITAC was founded in 2004 by many of the largest financial services companies in the United States. And the reason they came together to form ITAC was that they were already helping their customers who were victims of identity theft. They were on the front line fighting fraud to keep the fraud from happening. They were helping their customers recover. They were working with law enforcement. They were partnering with each other, but they recognized that they could do more. And in a spirit of what has turned out to be unique and very important collaboration, they came together and they funded a whole new project, something that had never been done before, ITAC, which is devoted to a three-part mission: victim recovery, partnering with law enforcement, education, and, well, then, of course, there's research as well. But the important thing about ITAC is its collaborative nature. And I think it is indicative of that collaborative nature that this kind of gathering can occur, where we have brought together, all of you have been kind enough to share your time and energy to come together on this very important topic from all over the country and from a variety of nonprofits and governments and private industry. And so a warm welcome to all of you. Before I go any further, I want to give thanks where thanks is due, and that's most particularly to my terrific team, Joanna, Crane, and Taylor Murray, who most of you have heard from over the last couple of months, but they've really been the driving force behind all of this. And while we're doing introductions, let me introduce Maria Sandler. And Malia is our scribe, our writer. She's actually going to produce for us a white paper on this forum. So I would encourage all of you, particularly the panelists, to make sure you say hi to Malia. She will be in touch afterwards and working on a white paper, which we hope to release at the end of March. So I've been talking to some of you about the importance of this forum and the importance of this kind of interaction. And when it's all over, we will have a wonderful document that you'll be able to use as a foundation for continuing research, and also to talk to your colleagues, to network with, to share with people who are interested in this topic. So I mentioned that ITAC Victim Assistance has a number of important missions, and one of them, of course, is helping people recover from identity theft. Thanks to the help of our partners at Intersections, which actually runs our center for us, ITAC has helped more than 125,000 consumers recover from identity theft over the last 9 years, which is a wonderful accomplishment of which we're very proud. We've also done a lot of work in education, partnering again with many of you, including one of our primary partners, the Federal Trade Commission, Steve Toporov and his colleagues, who produce such wonderful information that we often use to share with our industry and nonprofit partners. Law enforcement, as you may know, ITAC shares information about the people that we help provide us authorization to share case information with our partners at the Federal Trade Commission in the Sentinel database, and also with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service database, where it helps investigators piece together information about what may appear on the surface to be different crimes can in fact be connected. And research has been a part of our mission right from the beginning. 3 years ago, we were a co-sponsor of one of the Javelin identity theft surveys, what I'll call the adult survey, to distinguish it from the child ID theft survey that we sponsored just last year. And you're going to hear a lot more about that child ID theft survey that ITAC helped produce in the first panel. So when we I mentioned a moment ago that we have helped over 125,000 consumers recover from identity theft over the past 9 years. None of those were children. Now, that's not for lack of interest. We have been deeply aware, keenly aware of the problem of child ID theft for a number of years. However, our service, the Victim Recovery Service at ITAC, is centered on a tri-merge credit report. And as we all know, the credit bureaus cannot and do not knowingly maintain credit reports on minors. And so for that reason, our Victim Recovery Service has never been available to minors or to their families. That doesn't mean, however, that we haven't been focused on the problem and try to find ways to both quantify it and to find solutions. We participated in the Federal Trade Commission's Child ID Theft Forum, which again I know many of you participated in, and which forms the foundation for this program today. So let me talk very briefly about what you're going to hear about today. In panel 1, we're going to focus on the research, both the survey that ITAC sponsored last year and also other research that's been done around the country over the last couple of years. Focusing on better authentication, we're going to talk about how consumers and victims can develop better tools for managing child ID theft, and the whole problem of authentication is going to be a subject of discussion. And finally, research. Now at panel 2, we're going to have speakers from TransUnion, and at lunch, Scott Morrell from Utah Attorney General's office is going to talk about their exciting IRIS program. We're also going to hear from other public and private sector, about public and private sector laws and initiatives, including the one in Maryland. And on panel 2, we're going to hear from the Federal Trade Commission talk about their recent work. Then this afternoon on panel 3, we're going to have some experts talk about the impact that child identity theft has on the victims. What is the victim experience? And highlight some important factors to think about our work going forward, which is a good time to circle back to the white paper. We view the white paper that we will, as I mentioned a moment ago, hope to release by the end of March as a foundation for additional work in the field, and we look forward to all of your participation again on this topic. So just before I turn the program over to Taylor to introduce the first panel, just a quick word about logistics. There are a number of people joining us today on the phone, and so they are all on mute, and we are going to have to run this fairly tightly to make sure that everybody in the room gets a chance to speak and that we can all hear you and that the folks on the phone can hear you. So a couple of things. One is, the most important thing is when you want to speak, you have to press the white button on the microphone, and you must use the microphone. Otherwise, folks in the room won't hear you, and particularly our colleagues on the phone won't hear you. We're going to have a specific question and answer period at the end of each panel, so we'd ask you to please wait until the end of the panel, and then the moderator will open up the floor for questions. And if you are on the phone, and we will specifically give you a chance to speak too, remember you need to hit *6 to unmute your line, and then you'll be able to participate in the conference. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Taylor to introduce panel 1.
Well, thank you, Ann, and good morning, everyone. I want to thank you all first for joining us on this Monday morning after the Super Bowl. I think that if our program today runs more smoothly than the Super Bowl did last night, we should be in good shape. So we have a great program for you today, and I hope everyone is looking forward to it. My name is Taylor Murray, and I'm the program manager here at ITAC, and I'll be serving as the moderator for Panel 1. So Panel 1, we've titled Identifying the Problem, and we really want to focus on the current research on child identity theft. And our goal in Panel 1 is really to set up the foundation for the issues and the challenges that we're going to hear discussed today on Panels 2 and 3. So by discussing the current available research, we really want to establish the scope and the nature of the problem of child identity theft. We really want to try to identify the harm and quantify the harm experienced by child identity theft victims. We want to examine any trends in the way that the crime of child identity theft is being perpetrated. And finally, we want to identify any particular vulnerable populations. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Joanna Crane. Joanna Crane is currently a senior consultant here at the Identity Theft Assistance Center. She's a subject matter expert, and she's also a consultant for a variety of ID theft-related organizations. She sits on the board of directors of ITAC, as well as the board of advisors for ID Experts' Medical ID Alert System project. And prior to retiring from FTC in 2010, she had been a senior attorney and the identity theft program manager there. Ms. Crane is a frequent speaker at workshops and conferences and participates in a variety of working groups, task forces, and training and research initiatives. Before taking responsibility for the FTC's identity theft program, Ms. Crane brought enforcement actions against unfair and deceptive business practices such as fraudulent work-from-home businesses and opportunity scams. So today, Ms. Crane will be presenting the results of the 2012 Child Identity Fraud Report, which was sponsored by ITAC, Intersections, LexisNexis, and performed by Javelin Strategy and Research. Our second panelist will be Dr. Steve Coggeshall, who's the Chief Technology Officer at ID Analytics. At ID Analytics, he leads the analytics team doing modeling, algorithms, and research and development around very large data sets. Prior to his time at ID Analytics, Dr. Coggeshall was the Group Vice President of the Technology Development Organization at H&C Software. Before that, Dr. Coggeshall co-founded CASA, where he directed the consumer behavioral and portfolio modeling analytics. Dr. Coggeshall has spent his 25-plus year career leading scientists to build practical solutions to difficult business problems using advanced analytics. And today, Dr. Coggeshall will be presenting on ID Analytics' efforts to monitor its database for the misuse of children's identities and to quantify the various modes of identity misuse for children. Our third panelist will be Lynn Langton. She's a statistician at the Victimization Statistics Unit, the Bureau of Justice Statistics at the U.S. Department of Justice. Lynn Langton has overseen the collection of data and authored reports on a wide range of topics, including specialized units within law enforcement agencies, women in law enforcement, indigent defense, hate crime, and victim services. In recent years, Lynn has focused on the collection and dissemination of data on identity theft victimization obtained through the National Crime Victimization Survey and through 2 identity theft supplements to the NCVS. She's authored multiple BJS reports on identity theft, including identity theft reported by households in 2007, victims of identity theft in 2008, and identity theft reported by households from 2005 to 2010. Today, Lynn will be presenting on ID theft among adolescents in the NCVS. And our final panelist in panel 1 will be Dr. Axton Betz, who's an assistant professor of consumer studies at Eastern Illinois University. Axton's most recent research focuses on the experiences of adult child identity theft victims, or adult child identity theft victims are individuals who had their identity stolen while under the age of 18, but did not learn that they were victims until they were age 18 or older. Her passion for this research is rooted in her own experience as an adult child identity theft victim. She received a PhD in Human Development and Family Studies from Iowa State University and has spoken on the topic of identity theft extensively. She frequently contributes to national and regional media on child identity theft and has been featured on NBC News, Smart Money Magazine, and The Life Glink Show. Today, Dr. Betz will be presenting her research on the experiences of adult child identity theft victims. And with that, I'll hand it over to Joanna.
I've got a clip on my mic here. Let me figure this out. Okay. Can everyone hear me? Is this close enough? Okay, good. Good morning, everyone. And again, thank you so much for coming out on this morning, early today after the big Super Bowl last night. Wasn't that a great game? And I hope you had enough coffee this morning to wake you up, because I know that my presentation with all of the percentages and numbers
is rather challenging for first thing in the morning, especially after a late night. So I will try to make it short and interesting and exciting, but the exciting part really depends on if you're really into numbers. So we'll see. As Ann said, ITAC undertook the study to test the prevailing wisdom about identity theft against what the numbers would show. And so first I'll cover our top-line finding on identity theft, which is obviously the incident rate. Second, I'll talk about what the data shows about some of the big takeaways that were established at the Stolen Futures Forum, which was hosted by the Federal Trade Commission and the Office of Victims of Crime in July 2011. It raised a lot of interesting points, and now we have some data to support those points. Lastly, I'll talk about what some of the new findings from our survey are and wrap up with what the policy implications from those might be. Now, I want to warn you, the slides we were provided with the study are very detailed. And so I don't expect everyone in the room to be able to actually read all the detail. The reason I'm including the slides is to sort of show you the general pattern, which is the important part, and then I'll explain that to you. So please don't strain your eyes trying to read the details. If you wish to get a copy of the report so you can read more of the details, of course, we'll make that available to you. So thank you, and I'll get started. I hope I'm going in the right direction here. No, okay. And here we go. The first thing I think you need to know about our survey is that it was an online survey, and our respondents were 5,100 households with children under age 18. That's the only population we asked. Javelin uses a service called Knowledge Base to ensure that they can overcome the digital divide that is often presented by online surveys, so they could really access that hard-to-reach population. And I would say that since of the 5,100 families that were interviewed, 129 had actually experienced identity theft, we have a rather small sample size which does not allow us to dig into causality behind our findings. So for that, we would need a much larger survey, but this is a good first step. Now for our top-line results. An estimated 287,000 households discovered ID theft in the one-year period prior to the survey. Percentage-wise, that's an annual 0.85% of households with children under the age of 18. Let's compare that annual rate of 0.85% to adult ID theft, where Javelin's annual rate for 2011 was 4.9%. We can find that adults were about 6 times more likely to experience ID theft than were children in that one-year period. Now, overall, the survey found that 2.5% of U.S. households with minors nationwide had at least one child victim of ID theft. That means approximately 1 in 40 households with minors had at least one child ID theft victim, and that equates to about 844,000 children. Now, factoring in another finding, that 24% of victimized households reported that they had 2 or 3 victimized children, that estimate would grow to over 1 million child victims nationwide. Now, we knew going in that underreporting could be a problem with our survey because this is a survey directed at parents, and we know from other research that parents are often the perpetrators, so we didn't expect them to reply truthfully to this survey. And furthermore, children who didn't discover their childhood identity theft until after they turned 18 wouldn't be included in this survey because it asked parents about children aged under age 18. Now, here's a good example of a slide where it's not the details that I was trying to go for. I just wanted you to see the general trends, which I'll explain. Overall, I would say that our survey seemed to support some of the big takeaways from Stolen Futures. And the bar chart on the left, see if I can get this laser pointer to work, yes, shows that the SSN was the identifier most commonly used by thieves, most commonly stolen and used by thieves, and that all other identifiers were at a significantly less stolen rate. So I guess that means, first of all, it's the SSN that thieves want, and secondly, that's the only thing they want. They're probably using it to create a synthetic ID, which they would then use the child's SSN and other identifying information, perhaps made up or from other people, And that's important to know because synthetic ID presents challenges that we'll be talking about in other panels. Also, this pie chart on the right, and you don't need to read it, it's complicated, but the combination of those two pies means that 27% of victims' parents indicated that family members or friends were the culprits, and that's another finding that was discussed at Stolen Futures. I can only imagine, I was surprised it came back at 27%, and I can only imagine what the number would have been if the culpable parents had also responded. One of the sort of top-line findings from Stolen Futures was that ID theft detection tools that work well for adults don't seem to work the same way for children. And we can see that in two ways here. For example, thieves are able to continue using a child's information for much longer before detection. So this chart on the, let's see, my left, your right. Your left, my right. This chart along the x-axis is the length of time it took to discover, starting from 1 day and ending at 5 years or more. And you can see a line drawn right along there. That's the cutoff point, which tells us that 17% of child ID theft victims, it took the family 1 year or more after misuse began to detect the crime. Now that's an extraordinarily long time. By comparison, only 10% of adults took more than 6 months to discover the crime. So it's just, it's a whole different ballpark. Also, you see a big bump at the end of the x-axis. That is a surprising result that 30% of the victim families did not even know when the misuse began. And we found throughout the survey a greater deal of uncertainty about the facts of the crime among victim families than what we normally encounter in adult surveys. The pie chart on the right shows that an inordinate amount of child ID theft is only discovered when bad things happen. That's what I call negative downstream effects, and they're shown in red. Negative downstream effects include the parade of horribles that we all think about, such as being denied government benefits, services, tax refunds, being contacted by a debt collector or collection agency or creditor, being notified by the police or law enforcement or another government agency, or when the dependent is turned down for a new account due to bad credit. While 38% of child victim families discover the crime by these bad events, only 4% of victim adults reported discovering the crime as a result of these types of bad things in Javelin's most recent adult survey. So this tells us that the detection and deterrence tools used for adults don't really work for children. And in fact, you can see down here, they didn't play a big role in the families discovering it. Only 5% of families reported they had been able to discover it through a monitoring a child's credit report, and 2% said a monitoring service had indicated to them they had a victim in the family. Now, hopefully these numbers will grow in the future as pilot projects that panelists here today and education materials that we'll be talking about today will sort of take root, and families will have new ways to detect. As this slide graphically displays, it takes child ID theft families an average of 7 times longer to discover the fraud than it does for adults. And this just counts the lucky ones that discovered the fraud before the child turned 18. The survey data also supports the conclusion from Stolen Futures that ID theft resolution tools don't work as well for child victims, as shown here by the differences in the resolution rates and the number of hours it takes to resolve. The survey found that a surprising 32% of families, the orange piece of pie, were still having problems they could not resolve at the time of the survey. Contrast that to Javelin's most recent adult survey, where only 9% had unresolved issues. Also, the average number of resolution hours, you can see here, for children is 3.5 times higher than for adults. And now for some new findings. The survey provided for the first time some interesting demographic information about child identity theft. Statistics have generally shown that adult identity theft is largely an equal opportunity crime, and no particular income level or racial or ethnic background is at significantly higher risk. Child ID theft shows a different pattern. As family income decreases, the risk of child identity theft increases. In fact, 50% of victims' households made $35,000 or less, and only 10% of victims' households earned $100,000 or more. In addition, race and ethnicity affects a household's likely of experiencing child ID theft. What this rather complicated chart means, just to boil it down, is that Hispanic and Latino households are about 3.5 times as likely to experience child ID theft than are white or Caucasian families. And Black or African American families are about 2.5 times more likely to experience this crime than white or Caucasian families. Another interesting fact is that 64% of victim families have multiple children in the household. So there's an increased rate among multiple children households. And together, what the slides mean is that in a nutshell, about 24% of all victim families have 2 or more children victimized, which I had mentioned early on when I covered the stats. Now, I don't have slides to show you, but I can tell you that 13% of the parents of child victims indicated that they themselves had been victims of child identity theft. So there seems to be an intergenerational component to this crime. The data also showed a somewhat elevated risk if the head of the household was divorced or a single parent, a student or disabled, or their educational level was a high school diploma or they had not completed high school. Now that we've talked about who is most vulnerable, let's look at what. What are the thieves doing with the children's information and why did they steal it? This slide shows the striking difference between what thieves do with adult information compared to what they do with children's information. We've broken ID theft down into 3 broad categories for comparison, which I'll explain. First category is misuse of an existing account that would normally be someone's credit card account or debit card account or checking account. And as you can see, 85% of adults report misuse of an existing account, primarily credit cards, whereas only 25% of children child ID theft resulted in existing account misuse, which made sense to me because not many children I know have existing accounts. However, for non-account fraud, which is stealing information to commit fraud such as filing a fraudulent tax return or obtaining employment, the picture is very different. Children are 4.5 times as likely to have their information used for non-account fraud. And children are 3.5 times more likely to have their information used for new account fraud, which is where the thief uses the child's information, probably the SSN, to open a new account. Now, the stats on this chart, in my opinion, may be the key to why it takes so long for child identity theft to be discovered and resolved. Since 2003, all studies done on adult ID theft have found that different types of fraud result in different measures of harm. Existing account is often quickly detected and resolved with $0 lost. It takes significantly longer to discover and resolve new accounts that have been opened, but the most severe harm occurs when the victim's information is used for non-financial account purposes. Going into a little detail, I know you cannot read this slide. I'll just tell you that I have circled some of the bars in red because the point I'm trying to make is that accounts such as utility accounts for gas, electricity, and water are very popular among child ID thieves. That's this line here. Whereas utility accounts don't even rate 1 percentage point among adult ID theft victims in terms of the new accounts opened. So mobile and landline phones and service accounts and new internets are also very popular when using a child's identity theft, information for identity theft purposes. And they are also not the typical identity thief's Willie Sutton accounts. That is, they are not where the money is, which is what we see overwhelmingly among adult ID theft. Why not? 2 theories I'm going to put forward. And again, I don't have any statistical basis for this, but I know that typically we believe that it is easier to get a new utility, phone, or internet account without providing a high standard of authentication than it is to get financial accounts. So these may be easier for a thief using a synthetic identity to obtain, and they may also provide gateway accounts for getting financial accounts once the thief establishes a credit record using the child's social security number. Another theory is that child ID theft is often a crime committed by those of poor or no credit or who lack the legal documentation needed to obtain what many would consider the necessities of daily life. Very quickly, here are the types of non-account fraud committed using children's information. Leading misuse is fraudulently filing income tax returns, which we keep hearing about, and especially now that we're getting closer to tax season. So if we have anyone here from IRS today who'd like to talk about that later during the Q&A session, I think we'd all love to hear about that. Renting an apartment or home, obtaining employment, occupy second and third place, concealment from law enforcement when caught committing a crime or traffic violation occupies 2 bars on this chart, which would bring it up to 11%, tying for second place. And so I just want to say that for these types of fraud, remember that there are fewer detection and recovery mechanisms available, which tends to cause huge problems for everyone involved. So I think we can see why it takes longer to detect and resolve child ID theft. Here's the detail on existing account misuse. I just want to say that who knew children had so many checking accounts, savings accounts, and debit cards? The lesson here to me is they need to guard them more securely. For convenience, this chart summarizes child versus adult comparisons for some of the key metrics, and the only ones we haven't talked about are the dollar losses. You can see here that the mean fraud amount, which is the amount lost to business, is higher for children than it is for adults, perhaps because the thieves are able to continue misusing a child's identity for longer without detection. But the mean out-of-pocket costs are lower, perhaps because children cannot be held legally responsible for contractual liability or obligation, so they have less motivation to just sort of pay the debt anyway, which is what we hear some adults do to get rid of the problem. And here are my big conclusions for the day. Prevention, I think, is made more difficult because synthetic IDs defy the automatic credit report system. A creditor won't readily know there's a child behind that blank slate. So we need to find ways to make the SSN less valuable to thieves. Also, when the culprit is a family member or close friend, the easy access they have is practically impossible to overcome. So perhaps, in addition to the fact that this appears to be a multi-generational crime, perhaps a targeted educational program could be put in place here. We learned that detection and resolution also seem to be less effective. This is not just because of the challenges presented by synthetic ID theft, but also because so much of child ID theft occurs outside the realm covered by credit reports from the 3 major CRAs, which provide primary detection tools for adults. So we need to develop tools to cover non-account fraud, as well as a lot of the non-financial new accounts like utilities as well. And lastly, education and assistance. The survey showed that vulnerable populations are at a higher risk, so it would be more efficient and effective to direct our educational resources to these populations. And I hope that the panelists and attendees here today who have experience with working with these populations can tell us what they've learned about how to get educational messages out to them and to provide assistance to them. And we also learned that victims' families express a higher degree of uncertainty about the facts of the crime. And so here again, education and assistance would be especially rewarded. So I hope that during the forum today we can talk about how to provide the families of child ID theft victims as well as young adults who have discovered they were victims of the crime with more education and victim assistance to help them in their detection and recovery from this very harmful crime. Thank you for your attention. And now I'll turn it over to Steve Coggeshall from ID Analytics. And here is your remote mic.
Thanks, Joanna. Thank you. All righty. So I think we're holding questions until the end of this panel. So I'm going to talk about some research that I've done recently on child identity theft. But unfortunately, first I have to tell you who we are. So I'll try to skip through that as quickly as I can. So here's a kind of an overview of what I'm going to talk about. We do see at ID Analytics hundreds of millions of applications for credit cards, cell phones, retail credit, and other products and services. And we monitor these for the misuse of all identities. But here I'm going to be talking about children's identities. And we can identify and quantify the various modes. And I'll talk about that, of identity misuse. And the bottom line is we estimate about 1.9 million children's identities misused each year. And I'll also comment that the statistics that I'm going to show are not inconsistent with the other statistics. Even though this number looks a lot higher than Joanne's 287,000, It's certainly a different point of view, but we're explicitly able to see parents misusing children's identities who wouldn't necessarily respond on the survey. So that's the big difference, and I'll talk more about that. So again, I'm going to go quickly through these slides about who we are. It's important for you to see it because you need to understand the visibility that we have, but I certainly don't want this to be a commercial. So we were founded in 2002 specifically to fight identity fraud. We've got visibility into how an identity behaves across the U.S. economy. We apply machine learning analytics to large data and real-time transactions, and we have a variety of products around identity fraud, scores and compliance and quiz products, and we also serve as the backbone of many of the consumer identity protection services. Again, we operate the only real-time network of identity data. We do fraud. We serve up fraud scores for these. We're trusted by over 250 companies who use our scores, 6 of the top 10 financial services companies, 2 of the top 4 wireless, cell phone companies, government agencies, and we have partnerships. We also, the other part of our business is that we monitor more than 5 million active consumers that are subscribed to the identity theft protection services. And we serve 6 of the top 8. So it's, we were bought about a year ago by LifeLock, who's one of the top 8, but we still serve many more of these companies. So we actually serve LifeLock's competitors. This pictorially represents what we do. On the left-hand side is how we interact with enterprises. We receive events from them, primarily applications for products and services, and we return scores in real time, the likelihood that that's an identity fraud. And then on the right-hand side, what we do is for consumers who are enrolled in our monitoring services, we deliver them alerts. So when we see their personal identifying information being used, we send them a real-time alert, get it on a cell phone or an email, however you like, and if it's not you, you get to respond immediately and say, that's not me, and shut that thing down. So here's another picture of that. So what we do is all U.S. consumers are submitting applications for financial services, cell phones, retail credit, utilities, but we don't see it all. We see about 1/3 to 1/2 of all that volume. And what we do is we build scores, and we score those, and we say, is this a fraud? And then we deliver those scores back to the enterprises, and the enterprise will shut down some of those, and that's all done in real time. The other side of our business, the consumer monitoring side, again, we watch all these applications coming in from all these consumers, and we can associate those applications with consumers. So, typically they are, it comes from a person, and we know who that person is. That application is purported to come from. And on U.S. consumers, there's some fraction of the consumers that are under 18. And we monitor a fraction of U.S. consumers. We monitor about 5 million consumers right now, and some of those, about 200,000 of those, are children. So we're directly monitoring the identities of children for misuse. And what we do then is we send real-time alerts to the people that we monitor, and they have a chance to respond and say, that's not me. And because of that, we have direct information about the misuse of children's identities. So we've monitored almost 200,000 children for identity fraud since 2009, and we've observed almost 5 million children months of monitoring. So it's the number of children for each month. And every time we see a child's identity being used, we send an alert, and they have the chance to respond. And the number of alerts sent so far is over 10,000. So why are these children's identities being used in applications? First, I want to point out that it's illegal for that to happen. These are contracts for cell phones, credit cards, retail credit, and it's not legal for people under the age of 18 to enter those contracts. So what's going on? So again, we see about 1.9 million of these every year. So why? That's the big question. Now, because of the responses that I get from the not me alerts that we send out, I can explicitly quantify the different modes of fraud going on here. So the first, I see fraud by children. They're typically the 16 and 17-year-old children who are misrepresenting their date of birth, but they're using their socials and their names and addresses appropriate. And I see about 130,000 a year of those. So fraud by children themselves. This is another large category that we can't underestimate, or that we can't forget. There are just typos on the SSN, and somebody puts in a typo and they just happen to they accidentally use a children's SSN. 170,000 per year that I see of those. Then, this is the most important category, the category that we're really focused on. This is the explicit fraud by strangers who are deliberately using a child's identity. 220,000 a year. But the biggest category I see is fraud by parents. And this is about 1.4 million a year. And this is what you won't see generally when you look at surveys. So here's another look that I did, research that I did about a year ago that looks at the identity mixing up of people in the United States. So what I'm doing here is I'm using identity resolution technology to figure out who's the real person behind every application for one of these products. And when I do that, I can see people using multiple Social Security numbers, multiple dates of birth, variations in their names. I see people deliberately manipulating their identity. And I find many instances of people sharing Social Security numbers across generations. So I'll see parents using their children's Social Security numbers, for example. And I'm able to quantify that. So it's a little confusing, but here's some examples of how this works. So these are examples of a Larry Schmidt who's 23 years old, and I see him using a Sarah Schmidt in the same household, the SSN for that person. And a Broxton of, it looks like a father-daughter pair there on the Broxtons, and then here's a 12-year-old whose Social Security number is being used by an adult in the family, in the same address with the same last name. Now, it's a little off topic, but so those are on the left-hand side, those are the likely victims, young children. The likely perpetrators are these credit-seeking parents. Again, off topic a little bit, but I can also observe adult children who are misusing their elderly parents' identities. So these are people who are same last name, same household, that are using SSNs, not only their own SSNs, but also the SSNs of their what appears to be their adult elderly parents. I see many examples of that. Then I also see people using mixed Social Security numbers with ages in between, and I can't really quantify or say anything about that. I don't know who's the victim and who's the perpetrator on these mixed pairs. So now this picture's a little bit confusing, but for every one of those pairs, so I see a Social Security number being used by two different people. It belongs to the child or it belongs to the elderly parent, but I see a person using multiple Social Security numbers. Now I can look at the younger person, the age of the younger person on the pair, and this is what the distribution looks like. And what you can see is this bump right here. This is people who are below the age of 10 whose social is being used by someone of a generation above them. And these are likely children victims. So this is another way to quantify by this visibility. And from this set of analysis, it corroborates that I see more than 1 million children and parents mixing their identity information. Again, off topic, but on the other side, I can also see, with some fuzzy boundary, I can see some elderly people whose socials are being used by a generation below them, and those are likely parents. But this analysis is independent from the one I showed before, and it supports the fact that that from the other analysis from the not-me's and the alerts and the monitoring, direct monitoring, that there's more than about 1.4 million parents who are using their children's identities. So to summarize, we have direct visibility into the improper use of personal identifying information across all these organizations, financial services, telecommunications. We see about 200 million of these applications a year. We're in a unique position to get direct feedback from the people that we monitor, from our enrolled consumers in these protection services. We monitor the PII for about almost 200,000 children right now, and we've observed more than 10,000 of the improper uses. And I'm able to quantify by the feedback from those things what the different categories are. I can quantify the rates of misuse, and I can project to the entire population of children, and I make these estimates that about first-party fraud by children. That's children misusing their own or misrepresenting themselves and committing fraud by declaring they're over 18, 130,000 a year. Typos, about 170,000 a year, and the category that we're focused on mostly here is strangers misusing children's identities, 220,000 a year, and that's what you're going to hear from surveys because the parents will report that. But the hidden danger here that you generally won't see from surveys is parents misusing their children's identities. And it's substantially higher than any other modes, about 1.4 million a year. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Good morning. As Taylor mentioned earlier, my name is Lynn Langton. I'm a statistician with the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And so far to this point, you've heard about two different sources of data on child identity theft victims. And I'm going to talk to you about a third source that uses a slightly different methodological approach, and that's the National Crime Victimization Survey. The NCVS, as we call it, is the flagship survey for the Bureau of Justice Statistics. It's a nationally representative survey that interviews persons in households, either in person or over the telephone, and it's conducted by the U.S. Census Bureau. Annually through the NCVS, we collect data from persons aged 12 or older in over 80,000 households across the country. So this is a massive data collection effort. And the NCVS specifically was designed to be a counterpart to the FBI's Uniform Crime Report. So because of that, with the NCVS, the difference between the NCVS and the UCR is that we collect information on victimization, crime victims' experiences that were both reported and not reported to the police. But because the survey is supposed to serve as a counterpart to the UCR, we're collecting through the core NCVS more information on more traditional street crimes, such as rape, robbery, assault, burglary, theft, those sorts of things. However, we also use routine supplements to collect data on other criminal justice issues and other crime types that we're not getting through the core NCVS. And in 2008, we conducted the first identity theft supplement to the NCVS. And that's primarily what I'm going to be talking about today. The 2008 Identity Theft Supplement was a collaborative effort between BJS, the FTC, the National Institute of Justice, the Office for Victims of Crime, and the Bureau of Justice Assistance. It collected data from about 56,500 persons aged 16 or older between January and June of 2008, so during a 6-month period. The reference period for the survey was the 2 years prior to the interview. So even though we're only interviewing people aged 16 or older, those people in the 16-year-old age group are potentially reporting on experiences that they had as young as age 14. So even though we're going to 16 and potentially 14, this is still obviously a shortcoming of the NCVS when you're trying to use it to measure child identity theft. But still, we can get some interesting information on that 16-year-old and up group. And then before we talk about some of that, the NCVS, through the Identity Theft Supplement, defines identity theft as the unauthorized use or attempted use of an existing account, such as a credit or debit card account, checking account, or the misuse of personal information to open a new account, or for other fraudulent purposes, such as getting government benefits or providing false information to the police. So similar definition as the ITAC survey. So moving on to some of the findings from the 2008 ITS. And here again, we're looking specifically at the 16 to 19-year-old group. And the 19 is the end point because theoretically those folks at age 19 could be reporting on experiences they had at age 17 and age 18. So during the 2-year period ending in 2008, about 300,000 persons aged 16 to 19 experienced ID theft. Persons aged 16 to 19 accounted for about 2.5% of all identity theft victimizations, but in contrast, they accounted for about 7.3% of the population aged 16 or older. Now talking about the types of identity theft experienced by child identity theft victims, or victims aged 16 to 19. What we see in this figure is that about 83% of victims aged 16 to 19 experienced the unauthorized use or attempted use of an existing account, such as debit or credit card account or checking or savings account. This is a little bit different than what we saw earlier, but again, the reason that we're getting such a high percentage here is, again, because we're only focusing on those at the higher end of the age group, so that could be a potential reason for the difference. About 17% of the victims aged 16 to 19 experienced the misuse of other personal information to open a new account or for other fraudulent purpose. And then, just to put this in context here, a similar proportion of victims aged 20 or older experienced the misuse of an existing account versus the misuse of personal information to open a new account. Moving on to the demographic characteristics of victims of identity theft aged 16 to 19. What you see here, first of all, is that the majority of victims were female, and that's true across both the 16 to 19-year-old group and the 20 or older group. And then also what you see is that compared to adult victims, a lower percentage of victims aged 16 to 19 were white, non-Hispanic, and a higher percentage were Hispanic, 19% versus 9%. So that's similar to the findings that we heard earlier as well. In terms of the monetary losses experienced by victims aged 16 to 19, about 34% experienced out-of-pocket losses of $1 or more as a result of the victimization. And what we're talking about when we say out-of-pocket losses are losses that were not reimbursed by a credit card company, a bank, an insurance company. And of those aged 16 to 19 who experienced some out-of-pocket loss, the average loss was about $190, with a median loss of about $50. Now again, to put that in some context, among victims aged 20 or older who experienced some out-of-pocket loss or $1 or more, the average losses were about $1,900 with a median loss of about $200. And the identity theft supplement also includes a whole series of questions on how identity theft victims respond to the victimization experience, how they felt about it, and what types of actions they took to resolve the issues. This first section, this first set of columns here, what we see is that about 33% of identity theft victims aged 16 to 19 reported experiencing moderate to severe distress as a result of the victimization. And this is a similar percentage to the percent of persons aged 20 or older who experienced moderate to severe distress. And then looking here at the second set of columns, about 11% of victims aged 16 to 19 reported the victimization to the police. And this was not statistically different from the 17% of persons aged 20 or older who reported it to the police. So those are some of the key findings from the 2008 Identity Theft Supplement. We did conduct a second Identity Theft Supplement. It just wrapped up in December, actually, of 2012. So we should have findings from that survey later on this year. And the plan is down the road to conduct the Identity Theft Supplement on a more routine basis, every 2 years, contingent on funding. There were some changes that we implemented with the 2012 Identity Theft Supplement, and the key one that's probably of most interest for measuring child ID theft is that we did add a new section of questions to the instrument to try to get at lifetime identity theft victimization. So potentially those respondents aged 16 to 19 who did not experience a victimization in the prior year, which is the new reference period, will be asked if they experienced any victimization, identity theft victimization, during the course of their life. So we may be able to get some information from that, and we'll know better when the Census Bureau delivers the data, which should be late spring, early summer of this year. So that is all I have, and I realize I did not provide contact information, but if anyone has additional questions, my email address is just my first name with a period, my last name at USDOJ.
Okay, my name is, oh, can everyone hear me? Up higher? Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay. Okay, again, my name is Axton, Betz, and today I will be presenting the results of my research, which focuses on the experiences of adult-child identity theft victims. So the outline of my presentation, I'll briefly share with you the purpose and research questions. I'll describe some of the more salient points of the method I used, and I will primarily focus on the results. So the purpose of this study was to investigate the experiences of adult-child identity theft victims. Again, those who were victimized while they were under the age of 18 but didn't learn of the crime until they were 18 or older. My research question is, what are the experiences of adult-child identity theft victims? With regard to the sample and data collection, again, I was looking for individuals who were adult-child identity theft victims, so they had to meet that criteria in order to be considered for the study. So therefore, my sampling strategy was purposive. I was focusing on that key characteristic of being an adult-child identity theft victim. To find participants, I utilized my professional network. I contacted many of you in this room that I knew worked with identity theft victims. And with utilizing those professional networks to find willing participants who met the criteria and wrap up all interviews and member checks, it took 10 months. I interviewed 6 participants, a total of 2 times. And from this chart here, you can see the different participant characteristics. Again, like research that's already been presented, the majority of my participants were female. They ranged in age at the time of the interviews from 18 to 30. And the age itself includes prior to birth up to age 16. The prior to birth is the case of synthetic identity theft, where the participant's social security number was misused before they were even born, and a different name was attached to the social security number. That social security number was assigned to that child when they were born. So with this being a qualitative study, which is different compared to the research that's already been presented, I was focused on generating themes from the interview data. And so my themes are negative emotional effects, lack of support, and parent as perpetrator. Again, parent as perpetrator is something that we've already heard about this morning. So with regard to negative emotional effects, and over the next few slides, I'm going to share some participant quotes with you that help support the themes. So this participant was confused, and they were angry with regard to their identity theft experience. In this particular case, they had been a victim of character identity theft at the hands of their father. So they were very angry as a result of this experience. They were literally pulled over at the side of the road, and they were arrested right at the side of the road during a traffic stop. Continuing on with negative emotional effects, this particular participant felt fear. Again, here in red, I'm not going to read the whole quote to you, but in red, always having to watch your back and wondering what was going to happen. It was nerve-wracking. It was too much, to be honest. This participant here was describing their identity theft experience as a whole. Continuing on with the theme of negative emotional effects with regard to disappointment, this particular participant knew who had stolen their identity, and law enforcement was aware who had stolen their identity. Law enforcement went to this person's house, met them at the door, interviewed them, decided that they looked too nice to be an identity thief, and so they didn't pursue any legal action. So this participant, again, they were disappointed in the law enforcement response. Switching gears to my second theme, lack of support. This particular participant, once they had gone through their identity theft experience, and this particular participant, it was a prolonged identity theft experience, they decided to advocate for victims, through media interviews and other outreach activities, and This participant's family was very embarrassed. They felt that, this is a personal matter, it was a family matter, because this is a case where the parent had perpetrated the identity theft, and the family didn't want the participant out doing media interviews, outreach, things of that nature. Continuing on with lack of support, the individuals in my study who had their identity stolen by a parent, and that is 3 of the 6, experienced a lack of support from their family in recovering from identity theft. And this is one of those participants. This participant, father stole their identity. The participant went to mom for help to recover their identity. Here it says she wasn't actually very supportive. And with this participant, his mother said, "You need to figure it out on your own. Go ahead and recover your identity. I'm not going to help you with that." Continuing on with lack of support, with this particular participant experienced a lack of follow-up from law enforcement. Again, this is a case where a parent stole the participant's identity. They were brave enough to go and file a police report, and the participant was expecting some sort of follow-up from the police, and they hadn't done that at the point of the interview. So moving on to parent as perpetrator, one of the things that I found in my research with all 3 participants who had their identity stolen by their parent was that they stole other identities as well. And so it could be other children in the family who the parent stole their identity, it could be other relatives, so on and so forth. And so with this particular participant, this particular participant's mother not only stole the identities of the participant, they also stole the identities of siblings, as well as in this particular quote, the participant's grandmother. All of the participants who had their identities stolen by their parent experienced a poor relationship with that parent. And with this particular participant, she says, "My mom and I aren't on very good terms," and that's due to the identity theft. Same here with another participant who had his identity stolen by his father. He says, "I never really had I guess you'd say, a father-son relationship with my dad." And so summary of themes. First one, negative emotional effects. I apologize. I shouldn't say reactions. I should say negative emotional effects. Characterized by anger, confusion, disappointment, and fear. Lack of support is characterized by a lack of support from law enforcement as well as family. And parent as perpetrator is characterized by poor parent-child relationships and the parent stealing other family members' identities. In qualitative research, there's such a thing as negative cases, and what that means is that the interview data or any other qualitative data that you might collect just doesn't fit well with the rest of the data. It defies the expectations that the researcher has. And that was the case with my 6th participant. He had his identity stolen by a parent, but unlike my other 2 participants, he didn't really have a lot of difficulty as a result of the identity theft at this point in his life. He was able to establish himself financially as an adult by obtaining a bank account. He was able to get a job with no problems. And so because he hadn't experienced any major problems, he, at this point in his life, as you can see there in red, isn't treating recovering from identity theft as a priority. He just doesn't see it as a problem because nothing bad has happened to him as a result of the identity theft at this point in his life. And so I will end there, and I will turn it over to Taylor for questions. Oh.
Okay, so now we're going to open up the floor for questions. I'd like to remind everyone in the room that if you do want to ask a question, the mic's placed around the table. In order to turn them on, you have to hit the white button at the center, and it should turn red, and then you can go ahead and speak into the mic and ask your question. And for those people participating through the webinar and by phone, remember you are in listen-only mode, so in order to ask a question, please first identify yourself in the chat room and have identify that you have a question, and then we'll call on you, and then go ahead and press *6 to unmute yourself and ask your question. So I'm going to get the Q&A session started, and this is a general question for all of the panelists. Really, I would like to know, what are some of the gaps in the research that need to be filled? What don't we know, but we need to know that would be critical information in trying to combat this problem of childhood identity theft? And anyone is free to start.
One question that this is Steve Coggeshall, one question that I'm faced a lot and asked a lot, and I don't have any visibility into, is the why. Why is the identity stolen? So that's a question that I struggle with a lot. Is it, especially when it's by a stranger or a parent? Well, either, any of those.
And as I mentioned, I think that victimization surveys are very challenging, because if you're talking to a household and you're interviewing parents, it's really hard to know the size of the gap that you're missing because the parent is the perpetrator. So hopefully BJS's NCVS survey going forward and asking about ever will help fill in that gap. There's another sort of thing I would call a gap. It's something that I've wondered about, and that is that if the Social Security number is being used by itself with other information, it creates what we in the business call synthetic identities, of course. What is the impact of that synthetic identity on the child victim as adult, or down the road when they're trying to get credit or employment or that kind of thing? Is there an impact, and if so, can we measure it? So I would like clarification, if such thing were possible, on the impact of a synthetic identity and what would be called a split file in the credit reporting system on the child identity theft victims.
Just to build on what Joanna was just saying, I think another challenge that we have with the identity theft supplements in the NCVS that creates a gap, not only that you may have a parent present when you're interviewing a child, and that could impact their responses. But the reason that there are a lot of reasons why we don't interview folks under age 16, but one of the big challenges is that below age 16, the questions that you would ask of adult victims are not necessarily relevant to child victims. A child age 12 probably doesn't know a lot about if their parents have a banking or savings account set up for them. They don't have credit cards. They don't really know what a Social Security number is and whether anyone's using it. So that's a big challenge, is coming up with questions and a way to ask questions of children to get some of these answers without going to the parents or other family members who might be the perpetrators.
Go ahead.
To echo off of Steve's comments, I do agree that based on the research that I've done, we need to know more about the why. Why do parents steal their children's identities? How do victims of child identity theft get chosen? It's a question that, as a victim myself of child identity theft, I've been wondering for 20 years. Why me? So again, I do think that we need to focus research more on the perpetrators of child identity theft, which is something that, to my knowledge at this point, has not been done.
All right, so now I'll open it up to the floor for any questions. Yes.
John Shimano with the National Foster Care Coalition. I guess a couple things, suggestion, and then also a question. For the Bureau of Justice person, I think one interesting thing to survey, perhaps you could look at the youth aging out of foster care. There are about 26,000 every year, and because I think some of their circumstances might be unique, but you might be able to also talk to them in terms of having some insight on what happened to them and to find out what percentage. The other question I had was for ID analytics in terms of monitoring children. How does that come about? I mean, are you asked to do that? And is there a service fee when you monitor children? And what would
Yes, generally. So these are people who subscribe to an identity protection monitoring service like LifeLock or Intersections or Identity Guard. There are a number of them out there that are offered. And so one has to ask the question, is there a bias in the data? Because the people that I'm examining are the ones whose families have signed up for this monitoring service. So I asked myself that question, and my conclusion is, if anything, the numbers that I showed are understating the problem, because these are the people who are probably not committing it as much as the general public. So I would say that my numbers, if anything, are conservative.
And
to follow up on that, and just a ballpark in terms of what that service, I'm thinking in terms of the child welfare system, what it might cost, but to monitor, what does that run generally?
These are commercial products, and they're well known, and it's typical of $10 a month to monitor an individual, and there are family services offered also.
And just to follow up on your point about foster care, that is another gap with the survey. Because it's a household survey, the National Crime Victimization Survey, we're only going to get children that are being fostered within a household, and we wouldn't know whether they're necessarily a foster child, so that's something that perhaps we should consider. If they're in some other institutional setting, though, we would not be surveying those folks. We have a project going on where we're looking at expanding coverage into group quarters, but that's work down the road. So that is another issue. You're right. If children are in an institutional setting, we're not picking them up in this survey.
This is Steve Katz from TransUnion. Just one point on the reason for the ID theft of the minor, particularly from another family member. One of the things that we see through contacts with our fraud victim assistance department is a parent who's estranged from the family, perhaps a divorced mother or father who's trying to go out and get an apartment, get heat for that apartment. They'll go ahead and actually take the minor's social security number because they have access to it, and they use that as a first step, and then sometimes that cascades into other uses.
Yes, Scott?
Scott Morrill, Utah Attorney General's Office. I have a question for Steve. I'm interested in your research on the underage children using their own social security or information for credit or whatever. What is the long-term effect of that? And based on the way our statute's written in our state, I'm not sure if that's a crime. Is it a crime in other states? And can you kind of elaborate on what happens to a child using their own identity to commit identity theft, if you will?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and I'm not an expert on that. It was my understanding that it's a federal law that people can't enter these contracts, but I may not be correct on that. I would defer to the lawyers in the House here. And I think it's an interesting question to ask about what are the effects, because they probably aren't as deleterious as if someone stole their identity.
Contract law, but identity theft, two different things.
Yeah. No, I'm talking about the contract. So it's my understanding it's illegal for them to enter that contract. So these people are deliberately committing a crime. They're under 18, and I don't think that's a good sign for someone entering adulthood. So the fact that they're doing that is probably not a good sign to their mentality and what they may be doing in the future.
Yes, Russell.
Russell Butler. Steve, you're finding out that a lot of these things, which are crimes, using the Social Security number of another, do you turn that over to law enforcement? Do you notify the victims, social service, protective service, credit bureaus, or do you just notify the person who's purchasing your services?
Yes, we don't generally deal directly with consumers or law enforcement, but we do work directly with the fraud investigative units within our customers' enterprises, so the banks and the cell phone companies. And then we work directly with our consumer protection services, the Intersections and the LifeLocks, and they're the ones who do the remediation and working with law enforcement.
I mean, in a lot of circumstances, if somebody abuses child abuse or neglect, they're required reporters. This is a financial way of abusing children, but I don't know if we have any similar laws requiring people to report when they find this financial abuse of children.
This is Howard Davidson from the ABA. Since Russell seems to be looking at me on that question, because that's an area, abuse and neglect, child abuse and neglect that we look at. I don't know of any statute dealing with the subject of child abuse and neglect that includes the financial misuse of a child's identity information as a defining characteristic of abuse or neglect. My guess is in elder abuse laws, you probably have that because financial abuse of the elderly is so common, but we're just beginning to learn about this issue as it relates to children. I've never seen a case brought, any examples of any litigation against parents through the child protection system, through the juvenile court, related to misuse of their child's financial information. So I think this is a new area of potential area of involvement.
Any further questions from anyone in the room? All right. At this time, we can also open up the phone lines to any questions. So if you have a question, either identify yourself in the chat room or go ahead and hit *6 to ask.
During this interim, I'm going to take an opportunity to say how interested I am that Steve Katz from TransUnion saw estranged parents, oftentimes single, divorced parents, using the child's identities for things like housing and utilities, which just maps my data like hand in glove. So apparently, there's a lot of evidence, or it's something that is supported from not just a victimization survey, but from real-life interpretation of the data.
I'll hold for just a few more moments. All right. Well, if we don't have any further questions, then I will end panel 1 a little early. Originally, we had scheduled to end panel 1 at 10:30 and take a break and begin at 10:45. Actually, if everyone would like to wait here for just a minute, we are actually going to be joined by the CEO of the Financial Services Roundtable, Tim Pawlenty. So he should be here any moment. And then once Tim has said his remarks, then we'll go ahead and take that 15-minute break. So.
So just a housekeeping note here. Because we didn't have enough chairs in the room for everybody, the panelists are not going to actually get up and leave and go to other seats as you normally see. Panel 1 is going to stay where we are. Panel 2 is right over there. Panel 3 is here. As each presenter will be speaking, they'll use the podium, but for Q&A and roundtable, this is where we're going to be. So you'll be able to see the presentation, you'll be able to see the speaker, but we hope that it won't inconvenience everyone too much, that you won't actually see all 6 panelists up front the way you normally would. But doing that would create sort of a musical chairs situation, and we thought we should better avoid that. So while we wait for the CEO, Tim Pawlenty, to arrive, I would just like to say that we have a lot of very distinguished experts in the room today who are in attendance, including, I assume they're here, Catherine Heath from the Department of Health and Human Services. Catherine, are you here?
Catherine was unable to make it. She informed me this morning.
Okay. Taylor, can you run down some of the other folks who are in attendance today? Do you have? Okay, we don't have our RSVP list here, but I do see that Mr. Pawlenty has arrived, and so I'll be able to turn the floor over for his welcoming remarks. Thank you.
How are you? Thank you. Well, I'm chewing on a cough drop, so I'm sorry for that. I think I'll get out of this light. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Financial Services Roundtable. We're delighted that you're here for this important gathering. We understand that the growing concern regarding theft of children's identification is
something that's on the minds not just of people in this room, but partners all across the country and people who are stakeholders and are concerned about it. As a parent of 2 daughters, you can imagine what it's like as an adult with all the faculties that an adult has to deal with identity theft and the frustration and the heartbreak and the inconvenience and the confusion and the anger and the damage that comes with that as a fully developed person. But then to have that sort of trauma and damage visited upon a child is exponentially more damaging. And the impact that has not just on the child but on their family is deeply disturbing. And I know it's disturbing to each of you in this room. And through ITAC and Ann Wallace's leadership, and thank you, Ann, for your continued great leadership on behalf of ITAC, we have an opportunity to convene a group like this of partners and friends and stakeholders who share the concern around identity theft of children. And I applaud you for being here today. I thank you for being here today. And we look forward to continue to work with you on these causes. A forum like this is important for a lot of different reasons, one of which is to share information and to collaborate around best practices and developments in the area. I know ITAC last year had a survey around the developing frequency and intensity of theft of children's identity. We can't solve problems unless we can understand them and measure them and understand the scope and nature of it, so a survey like that is important. And I know the important work that's been provided by others around this table. In terms of information sharing, you've already heard and you continue to hear throughout the day from speakers very accomplished and knowledgeable in this area. I know I want to brag on states because as a former governor, I always think states have a great approach to these things, but I know you've got a speaker, or maybe you've already had them, from Maryland and from Utah that will share some of the best practices and experience on the ground in those states that I think everyone can benefit from in terms of the collaborative spirit and information sharing spirit of this meeting. We house a number of operations here at the Financial Services Roundtable, one of which is a separate entity, of course, ITAC, but another is Betz, which is one of the leading cybersecurity teams in all of the trade association space in D.C., and if I could be so bold as to say it's probably the leading cybersecurity policy, regulatory, and communications team in the country. John Carlson is here. I know Paul Smolzer is here as well, and we're very proud of their effort. But that's a nice tie-in with the work that ITAC does, because a lot of the work around how do you identify threats, defend against threats, in real time respond to threats, communicate and collaborate with other stakeholders and lead government and sector entities, is a really important function. That's what Betz does. So there's a nice synergy between Betz and ITAC in this issue and beyond. So I know you've got a big agenda with a lot else to cover, but I wanted to thank you sincerely for your work, for your commitment to this cause. ITAC is an organization that is committed to it, and it's an important topic. And so we look forward to working with you as this issue continues to confront our nation's children. But we're going to fight back, and we're going to do everything we can to prevent and stop and mitigate against this threat. And thank you for your work in that regard as well. Have a great rest of the conference.